Sometime between November 5th and January 20th, I noticed it got harder and harder for me to regulate my nervous system. Practices and routines that I had constructed over the decades to keep myself grounded, to facilitate reflection, to help me walk with clarity and joy weren't enough anymore. I was vibrating, scared, felt some days dangerously off center. And I knew from years of experience the direction, at least, that the solution had to come from, for me. The world, particularly the world of religions and spiritual traditions, has developed over millennia not just teachings to guide us, but also practices. Perhaps through trial and error, they found structures, rituals, activities that we humans could do that would metaphorically throw the windows open or the doors open to our beings for all the breezes and movements of spirit, the ones we human beings enjoyed and benefited by being blown around and visited by. And the practices might be private or communal, studious or active and embodied, things practiced away from the world or right in the messy middle of it, but they were there. What was the purpose of all these practices? I've told the story from this pulpit at least once about a guru in India who boiled it down beautifully when he was asked at the Dharma talk one day about spiritual practices. Everyone who went to his ashram, and I went to the home ashram outside of Bangalore, everyone got taught this one practice. It was a combination of movements and different breath techniques. This man was the leader of millions of followers, and this was the practice he taught to everyone. And when asked about its significance, he said very lightly, surprisingly, "Try it. If it gives you more peace and joy, which it does for me, then do it. But if it doesn't, find something that does." Right. Ditto. Amen. The point stayed with me. There are any number of ways up the mountain of a life of peace and joy, right? Of finding grounding clarity regularly that exist in our world. And our job is to figure out what practice or practices it is that help us in our particular journey up that mountain. But the point is to get up that mountain or to stay on some path that takes us up it regularly. And the religions and spiritual traditions are not wrong about our human need, I think, I have experienced, for regular practices and structures that enable a life of depth and meaning to be more likely to happen. So, admittedly, this is a sermon I've already preached some version of before, and I will preach at least once a year. The redundancy to remind us to find, to commit to whatever set of practices it is that helps each of us up the mountain of our lives toward wisdom and compassion and service. The exhortation not to leave it to chance. And the certainty that with all the options there are, we will find ones that will give us, to quote the guru, greater peace and joy. And joy. It's lovely to be talking about this topic right now as one major world religious tradition in our world gears up for one of its most significant annual spiritual practices. Communal, but also practiced alone. This next week, on the evening of February 28th, the month-long Muslim observance of Ramadan or Ramzan will begin. I imagine if we asked the average non-Muslim how they would describe this month, they would name the practice of fasting from sunrise to sunset each day during the month. And that is central to Ramadan. And there are all these layers to it too, that to me are also emblematic and rich and illustrative of the layers of wisdom and beauty that accrete to and in a spiritual practice that are easy to miss if we're not doing the practices ourselves. This week on Wednesday, I found myself standing next to the head of the San Francisco Islamic School, Kashif Abdullah. Kashif and I had served on the board of the Interfaith Council of San Francisco, and there we were on the podium on Wednesday in solidarity with the obligation to provide sanctuary. Many of you were there too. Thank you for showing up. Kashif's tradition and ours believes that protecting the stranger is an obligation of faith, and that obligation is under attack right now, so there we were. Anyway, while I had the moment, knowing I was preaching a sermon about spiritual practices, I seized the opportunity. Poor man. And asked him what life would be like for the Islamic school now that Ramadan was about to begin. What's that going to be like for you in the next month? He said, well, the older students would fast all day, as they always did. Some of them actually were in the front row at this witness event. He brought them to see what a faith in action looks like, which I thought was phenomenal. And he said the younger students were only asked to fast until midday. But then he said, but many of them insisted on going the full day. We don't put any pressure on them, he said, smiling. They just insist on doing it. And then he continued smiling and said, it seems to feel important and joyful to them. 11 at this time of year, 11 and a quarter hours without food or drink. And the children find it joyful, Kashif said. The layers peel back. All I could think of is how, well, you can see, I can't even get through part of a worship service without water. And I feel agitated when my water bottle in my bag is empty and I can't refill it immediately. I mean, joyful? I would think he was spinning me. But I know enough about my own practices and life to know not everything is evident, as I said earlier, from the outside. Ramadan, of course, isn't just about a practice of fasting. For any of you who have practiced it yourself or have friends or family or have studied it or lived in a place where it's more obviously part of the cultural practice, it's also supposed to be this time of prayer and reflection. Some of the reflection seems almost inevitable that would come up in this month and people talk about. I mean, after all, nothing strips us back from any false sense of our own power and invincibility and puts us more deeply and immediately in touch with our vulnerable humanity than being without food or sleep deprived or thirsty. Fasting for a month is 29 to 30 days of being pressed fully down into your relationship with your vulnerable humanity. Human, as the Reverend Forrest Church used to remind me growing up, human is that word that's tied in its root to the same root as the word for humble, the word for humus, that black part of the surface of the earth that is rich with nutrients that happens when life returns to its elemental qualities. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Life, human, vulnerable, and fleeting. And nothing, too, reminds us of our connection to others, particularly those who are struggling, than being in intimate touch with our own humanity, as any of us know. Get sick, and immediately, when anyone you know or love is sick, your empathy levels have gone much higher than before your own time of feeling under the weather or worse. And the sharp aching in our own bellies reminds us of what our neighbors who are hungry are living with. And as much as we would want to be spared this experience, we are reawakened to wanting to spare them, anyone, from it. So not surprisingly, Ramadan is also a time when people often do acts of service, and what I learned this week is that it's the time when the requirement of zakat, of charitable giving, is most often expected and received. Zakat, you may remember, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. But I don't know how many people know details about zakat. And if I could, in the Phil Donahue show, I'd walk a mic around. I always just assumed it was some open-ended invitation to give, or tied to income the way tithing is in most Christian traditions. But do you know it's an annual expectation that a person will give 2.5% of their wealth? There are websites that help you figure out what that means, with Islamic scholars who have weighed in on translating the ancient doctrine into modern financial terms. I was so blown away by it that I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly, and I reached out to my friend Hala. She confirmed that there is a threshold that you need to exceed before you're expected to give zakat. She said there were years when she gave it and years where she wasn't expected to. And then she wrote of it, you are eligible to pay the 2.5% if you can. If you can. God does not make it hard on us. I loved that phrase. God does not make it hard on us, she wrote. Meaning, from this practicing Muslim woman who's wise and devoted to the teachings and the expectations, that she experiences this command to redistribute her wealth to the world, which, let's be clear, is a much bigger expectation than the sharing of income. It would change the world more radically if it was done universally. This modern woman experiences it as a loving requirement, as reasonable and right. God just wants you to even things out in the world. And not accidentally, I remind us, this act is often tied to this time of the year when Muslims will fast and be reminded of what it means to go hungry, to be vulnerable, aware of our own fragile humanity, and all this tied to the practice of fasting. Isn't that fascinating? Or am I just a religious geek? Which is true anyway. But lest I forget one other piece, and I know there's a lot I don't know about, I also want to name the joy that's part of this time of year for our Muslim friends and family and ourselves, if this is part of our practice. My father-in-law lived for 2 years and worked in Abu Dhabi, and he describes the break fasts that he was invited to, full of joy and delicious food as the sun was just set, and also of community and connection, invitation of strangers, extravaganzas of joy, you might say. And I wonder if Kashif's students get to claim full participation in that joy and have a sense that they are more fully part of it when they have engaged in the practice. And that's part of the importance and joy of it, he describes. What I think is true of Ramadan is true, I think, of a lot of our spiritual practices. I think even if we enter them some weeks or some days or some years sleepwalking, you can't often remain immune to the work of a good spiritual practice, what it's designed to do to your spirit. I mean, certainly I don't think you can sleepwalk through fasting, though we can all try if we want, experiment in the next week. Even in my own, I know, morning practice of journaling, there are days when I'm just writing because writing in the morning is what I hold myself accountable. I'm just sitting down and writing. But once into it, feelings come up and things about past days that I need to process show up in front of me and hopes. And before I know it, the window I forced open, though I wasn't excited about it that morning, while something has blown in. So I'm asking the question I'll ask again and again in our lives together: what practices do you have in place? What keeps you anchored to what matters most to you? Or what reminds you of what you are in danger of forgetting again and again? Or what just helps you grow your soul? Dorothy Bass, a historian of American religion and a director of the Valparaiso Project on the education and formation of people in faith, writes in her book, Practicing Our Faith, of a retreat that she and her family go to every year. Gadgets are left at the door. Food that's served is lower on the food chain. In her community, there's daily worship. In other words, she writes, we enter a community shaped by a shared practice that makes sense. And as we adjust to those practices, we feel ourselves becoming a little different, a little better. What practices, my friends, make you feel like you're becoming a little different, a little better? Because in these times, I imagine you either need to double down on them or dust them off or find one. I think it can be constantly evolving for us. I think at different times we can need different things. Though there are, for me, some steady ones I've hung on to because they work. And as I shared at the beginning of the service, at the sermon, between November 5th and January 20th, I noticed it was getting harder to regulate my nervous system and to be in the world with the presence that I wanted to, the one that's a gift and not a curse to others. And I noticed I needed help, so I called a friend, and she recommended meditation, and I've never loved meditating because I've never felt good at it. But spiritual practices are not about perfection. And she recommended a book, and the author said, among other things, that it wasn't about being good at meditation. It was about getting better at life, and you could be lousy at meditation and still get better at life in the process. So I was disarmed and engaged it, and felt after just a few days of the 15 minutes it asked that I was vibrating a little differently. Thank God. Over the years, I've heard any number of answers to the question I asked all of you. I've heard people talk of annual pilgrimages and silent retreats, which I think sound like hell on earth, but to each their own. In fact, my best friend and I decided we would only ever go on a silent retreat if we went together and were in the same room and could break the vows. I've heard people talk of daily practices like the serenity prayer that our beloveds in recovery say every day, many of them, to gratitude lists people write at their bedside at night, to sleep with joy and gratitude in their heads and hearts. I've heard of weekly practices, everything from hikes in nature to coming to church. One of our members, well, he's in the front row here, climbs to the local peaks many days of the morning to photograph the sunrise. And I've never asked you, Galen, if it's a spiritual practice or you would name it as such. But it strikes me from the photographs I sometimes see of those moments that that moment of awe of seeing a new day dawning makes it hard to take it not for granted, like our arms outstretched. So our practices can be embodied like those hikes or gardening or Tai Chi or the body prayer or yoga. They can take so many forms. They can be ancient and sacred and fixed or modern and free form. One friend told me her morning run is her spiritual practice, she's realized after all these years of feeling guilty for having none. Because in that hour, everyone leaves her alone, and she's out in the world in the cool quiet of morning, and she can be reflecting on her own life. And she's not the same on days when she doesn't run. So whatever you do, just keep doing it. So you and I, we don't sleepwalk through life. So we are ever more the person we want to be. May we find and support one another in practices that anchor and uplift us. Find the ones that give us, as the Guru said, more peace and more joy, because that's the goal. It's not another perfectionist task. And may we find peace and joy. And may our lives be steady through the storms ahead. And as a result, like Kashif's kids, be full of meaning and joy, always. Blessings. Blessings to us all. Amen.